My phone buzzed just as I lifted my coffee mug to my lips. And the message on the screen made my hand freeze midair. "You flying in today? Your brother must be so excited." It was from my cousin Lila. For a second, I thought she had sent it to the wrong person. My eyes stayed locked on the words, rereading them slowly as if they might rearrange into something that made sense. "Flying in today. My brother." Excited. My stomach tightened as I typed back. "Flying where?" The reply came almost immediately. "For Ethan's wedding? Don't tell me you're late again." The mug slipped slightly in my hand, hot coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim. I set it down carefully on the counter before it could spill. My fingers suddenly numb. Ethan's wedding. Today. I opened my email with shaking hands, refreshing the inbox once. Twice. 3 times. Nothing. No invitation. No message. No reminder. Just the usual work emails and promotional ads cluttering the screen. A cold sensation crawled slowly up my spine. I tapped into my phone messages and opened the family group chat, the one that had always been active with holiday photos and my mother's recipes. Except the conversation didn't open. Instead, a blank gray screen appeared. "You are no longer a participant in this conversation." I blinked once. Then again. I checked the screen carefully, convinced it had to be a glitch. But it wasn't. I hadn't left the chat. I had been removed. That was the moment something heavy settled inside my chest. Not confusion. Not panic. Recognition. Someone made sure I didn't know. I stood there in my small Portland kitchen, staring at my phone as morning light spilled across the counter. Outside, the sky was pale and quiet. The kind of gray morning I usually loved. The kind that made the world feel calm and predictable. But nothing about this felt calm. Or predictable. I leaned back against the counter and exhaled slowly, forcing myself to think clearly. If Ethan was getting married today, then this hadn't been planned overnight. There had been months of preparation, months of conversations, photos, events. And somehow, I had been erased from all of it. My fingers moved automatically as I opened social media and searched Ethan's profile. The first photo that appeared made my breath catch. Ethan stood beside Madison, his fiancée, smiling broadly beneath soft golden lights. They held champagne glasses while guests surrounded them, laughing and celebrating. Below the photo, the caption read, "Rehearsal dinner ready? Tomorrow is the big day." Tomorrow, which meant tonight was already in motion. I kept scrolling. Engagement party photos, dress fittings, family dinners. Each image carefully captured, carefully shared, and in every single one, my parents stood proudly beside Ethan, arms around Madison like she had always belonged there. Like nothing was missing. Like I didn't exist. One image stopped me completely. My parents stood behind a long decorated table covered with documents and floral arrangements. Several champagne glasses lined the front. Printed with elegant gold lettering, "Brooke's Wedding Planning Team." Planning team. The words burned into my mind. Everyone included, everyone smiling. Except me. I pressed my palm flat against the cool countertop, grounding myself against the rising pressure in my chest. Memories flickered through my mind. Birthdays where I had helped organize decorations. Holidays where I handled logistics. Family events where I quietly made sure everything ran smoothly. I had always been reliable. Always responsible. Always the one who fixed problems. And suddenly, I wasn't just excluded. I had been erased. I picked up my phone again and hovered over Ethan's contact name. Part of me wanted to call immediately. Demand answers. Force someone to explain why I had been cut out of something so important. But another thought interrupted that impulse. What if I didn't call? What if I showed up instead? That idea settled into my chest with surprising clarity. Not anger. Not desperation. Purpose. I opened my laptop and searched for flights from Portland to Dallas. The options were limited. Last-minute tickets always were. But one departure caught my attention. 3 hours from now. Expensive. Uncomfortable. Perfect. As I entered my payment information, Another memory surfaced, quiet but persistent. 3 months earlier, my father had called unexpectedly. "Just need you to sign something real quick," he said casually. "What kind of document?" I asked. "Routine vendor paperwork," he replied. "Nothing complicated." Something about his tone had made me hesitate. "Email it to me," I told him. "I'll review it first." He never did. At the time, I dismissed it as forgetfulness, one of his usual unfinished tasks. Now, sitting at my kitchen counter with a plane ticket confirmation glowing on my screen, that memory didn't feel random anymore. It felt connected. I packed quickly, just a carry-on bag with essentials. A few outfits. Neutral tones. Nothing flashy. Nothing festive. Not clothing for celebration. Clothing for observation. At the airport, travelers rushed around me in clusters, families laughing, couples holding hands, children tugging at their parents' sleeves. Everyone looked like they belonged somewhere. That contrast pressed quietly against my chest. By the time I boarded the plane, exhaustion had begun creeping into my shoulders, but adrenaline kept my thoughts sharp. Dallas greeted me with warm evening air that clung to my skin as I stepped outside the airport. The city buzzed with movement, cars rushing past, lights glowing, music drifting faintly from distant venues. Somewhere out there, my family was celebrating without me. Inside my hotel room, the silence felt almost unnatural. I set my bag down and pulled my laptop onto the small desk, opening my email automatically. Work messages loaded first. Routine updates, deadlines, schedules. But buried between them was one email that didn't belong. Sender: Brooks Family Events. Subject line: Wedding expense authorization, Natalie Brooks. My pulse quickened. I clicked the attachment slowly. The document opened line by line, revealing neatly formatted text, vendor details, payment schedules, legal language I recognized immediately. Then I scrolled down and stopped. At the bottom of the page sat my name, typed clearly. Underneath it, a digital signature that looked exactly like mine. For several long seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Because no matter how real it looked, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had never signed that document. My phone rang just as I was still staring at the signature at the bottom of the document. And when I saw my father's name flashing across the screen, my chest tightened instantly. I didn't answer right away. The sound echoed through the quiet hotel room, sharp and insistent, like it refused to be ignored. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. My finger hovered above the screen before I finally accepted the call. "Hello." There was a short pause before he spoke, just long enough to feel deliberate. "You made it into town already?" my father asked. His voice sounded calm. Too calm, not warm, not surprised. Just measured, like he had rehearsed the question. "Yes," I replied carefully. Another pause. "Did you check your email?" he asked. Not "How was your flight?" Not "Are you staying somewhere nice?" Just that. "Yes," I answered again, my voice steady. I heard movement on the other end of the line, a faint rustling, as if he had shifted his grip on the phone. "We'll talk tomorrow," he said. "Just don't sign anything yet." The line went dead before I could respond. I lowered the phone slowly and stared at the blank screen. "Don't sign anything yet." Not "don't worry." Not "this is a mistake." Just a warning. That alone told me everything I needed to know. I stood up and walked toward the hotel window, staring down at the busy Dallas street below. Cars moved in steady streams, headlights reflecting against glass storefronts. Somewhere nearby, I could hear laughter drifting faintly through the air. Music. Celebration. Life continuing like nothing was wrong. But something was wrong. Very wrong. I glanced at the clock on the wall. The rehearsal dinner had already started. Part of me wanted to stay in the room, to avoid the uncomfortable stares, the forced smiles, the quiet judgment that would follow my arrival. It would have been easier to hide behind silence and distance. But easier didn't mean smarter. And I didn't fly halfway across the country to stay hidden. I changed into a simple black dress, nothing flashy, nothing celebratory. The kind of dress I wore to professional meetings where clarity mattered more than charm. I tied my hair back neatly and checked my reflection one last time. I didn't look like a guest attending a wedding. I looked like someone walking into a negotiation. The restaurant hosting the rehearsal dinner was just a short walk from the hotel. Warm golden light spilled onto the sidewalk as I approached. Laughter and clinking glasses spilling out through the partially open doors. For a moment, I stood outside, steadying my breathing. Then I pushed the door open. The noise softened slightly when I stepped inside. Not silent, just lowered. Conversations slowed, heads turned. Eyes lingered a little longer than polite curiosity allowed. No one rushed forward to greet me. No one called my name. Instead, a quiet ripple moved across the room, awareness spreading without words. They hadn't expected me. I scanned the tables slowly until I spotted my parents seated across the room. My mother noticed me first. Her eyes widened briefly. Then her expression flattened into something neutral. Controlled? My father stood immediately and walked toward me. Each step looked deliberate, measured. When he stopped in front of me, he didn't smile. "You didn't need to come," he said. The words landed harder than I expected. Not hello? Not glad you're here. Just dismissal. Before I could respond, my mother appeared beside him, her voice too bright to sound natural. "Well, since you're here, you might as well sit." Might as well. Not welcome. Not invited. Aloud. I followed them quietly toward a table near the edge of the room. The decorations were elegant, polished glassware, soft floral arrangements, carefully folded linens. Everything looked expensive, carefully planned, carefully funded, just not with honesty. Across the room, I spotted Ethan standing beside Madison. He laughed at something someone said, his hand resting casually against her back. He looked relaxed, comfortable, like nothing about this situation was unusual. That realization settled heavily in my chest. Before I could decide whether to approach him, a tall man stepped toward me. His posture was confident, his suit perfectly tailored, his expression polished. Madison's father. I recognized him instantly from the photos I had seen earlier. His smile looked smooth. "Practiced. You must be Natalie," he said warmly. "The one handling the finances." My body went still. "I'm sorry," I asked. He chuckled lightly, as if the answer were obvious. "The one handling the finances," he repeated casually. "We've heard so much about you." A cold sensation slid down my spine. "I'm not handling anything," I replied carefully. His smile faltered for half a second before returning to place. "Well," he said smoothly, "I'm sure everything will work itself out." He walked away before I could respond. I sat there quietly, watching the room while my thoughts raced beneath the surface. Every sound felt sharper now, forks tapping against plates, glasses clinking, laughter rising and falling. Nothing about this felt casual anymore. Nothing felt accidental. Eventually, Ethan approached the table. He leaned down and hugged me quickly, too quickly, before pulling away. His expression was tight, his smile forced. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," I replied. I studied his face carefully. "Why didn't you tell me about the wedding?" I asked. His eyes shifted slightly, avoiding mine. "Things got busy," he said. The answer came too fast, too practiced. And while he spoke, I noticed something else. His gaze flicked briefly toward our father standing across the room, like he was checking for approval, like he needed permission to speak. That detail settled heavily in my chest. Later, as dinner continued and conversation grew louder, I excused myself quietly and stepped into the hallway near the restrooms. The noise faded behind me, replaced by a softer stillness. That was when I heard voices. Low, urgent. "Familiar? We just need her signature." My mother's voice. "After tomorrow, it won't matter." Madison's father. "She won't refuse family." My father. My heart pounded loudly in my chest as the meaning settled over me. They weren't discussing possibilities. They were discussing expectations. About me. I stepped back silently, retreating toward the dining room before they could notice me standing there. When I returned to my table, my expression stayed calm, controlled, unreadable. Minutes later, a woman wearing a wedding planner badge approached, holding a clipboard against her chest. "Can you confirm your contact details?" she asked politely. "For vendor payment processing?" She placed the clipboard gently in front of me. I looked down. My name was printed clearly at the top of the page. Below it, in bold letters, "Primary Financial Guarantor." The room seemed to narrow around me as the words settled into place. That was the moment I understood. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been positioned. I handed the clipboard back without signing a single line. "I'll need time to review this," I said calmly. The wedding planner hesitated for just a second, long enough to show surprise, before nodding politely and stepping away. Her expression stayed professional, but something about the tightness in her jaw told me she hadn't expected resistance. That detail mattered. They expected compliance. Automatic compliance. I remained seated for a few minutes after that, pretending to listen to the conversations around me. People laughed. Glasses clinked. And someone across the room started telling a loud story that earned bursts of applause. But everything sounded distant to me now, muted, like I was watching the room through glass. Eventually, I pushed my chair back quietly and stood. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. That silence followed me all the way out of the restaurant. The warm Dallas air hit my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk. But instead of relief, it brought clarity. My heels tapped against the pavement as I walked back toward the hotel, my mind already shifting into a different mode. Not emotional, analytical. By the time I reached my hotel room, my hands were steady again. I locked the door behind me, set my purse on the desk, and opened my laptop without hesitation. The authorization document appeared instantly on the screen, waiting exactly where I had left it earlier. This time, I didn't look at it like a daughter. I looked at it like an investigator. I zoomed into the signature first. At a glance, it looked identical to mine, the same looping curve, the same sharp finish at the end. Whoever created it had studied my handwriting carefully. Too carefully. I opened another folder on my laptop and pulled up several older documents, lease agreements, employment forms, financial approvals from my work. One by one, I placed them side by side on the screen, comparing, measuring, studying. At first, nothing obvious stood out. Then I zoomed in further, and there it was, a tiny detail most people would never notice. In my real signature, there was always a slight upward tilt in the middle of my last name, subtle, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The version on the wedding document didn't have that tilt. It was almost perfect. Almost, but not mine. My breathing slowed as certainty replaced doubt. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a forgery. I leaned forward and clicked into the Document Properties tab. Years of working with contracts had taught me something simple. Files always carried traces of where they came from. Creation date, editing time, upload location. Every detail left fingerprints, and this one left too many. The creation timestamp showed a time when I had been in Portland, logged into my office system. Attending a scheduled meeting I could verify in seconds, but the upload location told a different story. Dallas. Not Portland. Not my device. Dallas. My throat tightened slightly as I stared at the IP information tied to the document. The network address looked familiar, painfully familiar. It matched the business line registered to my father's office. I leaned back slowly in the chair, letting that realization settle into my chest. Not suspicion anymore. Direction. A memory surfaced without warning. 3 months earlier. My father calling late in the evening. "Just need you to sign something real quick," he had said. "What kind of document?" I asked. "Routine vendor paperwork," he replied. Nothing complicated. Something about his tone had felt rushed that night. Uneasy. Send it to me. I told him. I'll read it first. He never followed up. At the time, I assumed he forgot. Now, it felt intentional. Carefully delayed. Carefully planned. I returned to the document, scrolling further down until I reached the financial section. Numbers filled the page, itemized costs. Service fees, deposits already paid. Then I saw the total, $42,000. Seeing the number written there made something inside my chest tighten. That wasn't a small family contribution. That was a financial commitment large enough to change someone's future. I clicked open another linked attachment, vendor details listed in neat columns. Status. Pending, awaiting guarantor confirmation. That word again. Guarantor. Waiting for me. My phone buzzed softly against the desk, pulling my attention away from the screen. A text message from Ethan. You still in town? I stared at the message, unsure how to interpret it. Not an apology. Not an explanation. Just a question. Before I could respond, another message followed. Everything will make sense soon. That line made my stomach twist. Not comfort. Not reassurance. A warning disguised as patience. I set the phone down slowly and returned to my email inbox. This time, instead of opening the wedding message again, I typed one word into the search bar. Vendor. Dozens of emails appeared instantly. Far more than I expected. My pulse quickened as I opened them one by one. Draft agreements. Approval confirmations. Invoices marked as reviewed. All attached to my name. Some labeled as completed. Even though I had never seen them before, a cold realization spread through my chest. This wasn't one forged signature. This was a pattern. A system. Someone had been using my name, my reliability, like collateral, assuming I would eventually step in and fix the damage once everything became urgent. I leaned back slowly, staring at the glowing screen as old memories surfaced. Helping Ethan with homework when we were younger. Covering for him when he got into trouble. Fixing problems quietly so no one else had to. Responsibility had always followed me. But now, responsibility had been weaponized. Just as I reached to close the laptop, a new notification appeared. Another email. Sender. Vendor Services Department. Subject line. Final confirmation required. Natalie Brooks. My hand hovered over the trackpad before clicking it open. The message loaded slowly. If payment authorization is not confirmed by tomorrow, legal enforcement procedures will begin. I read the sentence once. Then again. Then a third time. The words didn't change. The threat didn't soften. That was the moment I realized they hadn't just borrowed my name. They had put my future at risk. My phone buzzed just after sunrise. The sharp vibration cutting through the little sleep I had managed to get. I reached for it instinctively, still half wrapped in the heavy silence of the night before. The screen lit up with a single message from my mother. Wear something formal. Photos start at noon. No good morning. No question about whether I arrived safely. Just instructions. I stared at the message for several seconds, letting its tone sink in. It wasn't warm. It wasn't emotional. It was logistical, the kind of message sent to someone expected to perform a task, not attend a celebration. That detail settled heavily in my chest. They weren't welcoming me. They were positioning me. I sat up slowly and swung my legs over the side of the bed, letting my feet touch the cool carpet. The quiet in the room felt thick, pressing against my thoughts as memories from the night before replayed, the whispered hallway conversation. The clipboard. The printed words declaring me the primary financial guarantor. None of it felt accidental anymore. I stood and walked toward the small wardrobe, unzipping my suitcase carefully. Inside were the few outfits I packed in a rush, neutral tones. Practical choices, nothing extravagant. One dress stood out immediately. Soft ivory. Light. The kind of dress someone might wear to celebrate. My hand hovered over it for a moment. Then I moved past it. Instead, I reached for the navy dress folded neatly at the bottom. It was structured. Professional. The kind of dress I wore to meetings where attention to detail mattered more than appearances. I pulled it on slowly, smoothing the fabric along my waist. This wasn't about celebration. It was about control. By late morning, I stood outside the wedding venue, studying the elegant setup stretching across the hillside. Rows of white chairs faced a floral arch decorated with pale roses and greenery. Guests gathered in clusters, chatting easily as soft instrumental music drifted through the warm air. From a distance, it looked perfect, beautiful, carefully planned. But perfection always came with a price. As I stepped closer to the entrance, a young woman holding a tablet greeted arriving guests with a practiced smile. "Name, please," she asked politely. "Natalie Brooks," I replied. Her fingers tapped quickly across the screen. Her smile faltered just slightly before returning. "Here you are," she said, handing me a small printed card. I glanced down. The name printed on the card made my stomach tighten. Natalie Brookman. Not Brooks. Not correct? Just close enough to seem careless, but wrong enough to feel deliberate. I didn't correct her. Not yet. Instead, I walked toward the large seating chart displayed near the entrance. Guests crowded around it, laughing as they searched for their assigned tables. I waited until the group thinned before stepping closer. My eyes scanned the alphabetized list slowly. Brooks. There. I traced my finger along the line until I found my name. Table 17. I stepped back slightly and looked toward the far edge of the reception area. Table 17 sat in the back corner, near the kitchen doors, where servers moved constantly between trays and carts. It was distant from the main tables where immediate family members gathered. I scanned the front tables again. My parents sat at table 2. Ethan and Madison at table 1. Even distant relatives I barely recognized were seated closer than me. That placement wasn't random. It was intentional. The ceremony began shortly afterward. Guests took their seats, conversation softening into whispers as music filled the open space. I walked slowly to table 17 and sat down. From that distance, the floral arch looked smaller, less detailed, like something viewed from the wrong side of a photograph. As Ethan walked down the aisle, guests smiled and wiped tears from their eyes. My mother dabbed carefully at the corner of her eye while my father sat upright beside her, his expression proud and composed. Everyone looked emotionally connected, except me. I watched the ceremony like an observer studying unfamiliar behavior, noting details without feeling them. The vows, the applause, the laughter, all of it felt distant, disconnected. By the time the reception began, music filled the space again, louder this time, mixing with the steady rhythm of conversation and clinking glasses. Servers moved between tables offering drinks. Guests gathered near the dance floor, and I remained seated quietly, watching. That was when Madison's father approached. His posture remained polished, confident, his expression controlled behind a thin smile. "I assume you reviewed the vendor agreement?" he said casually. No greeting, no introduction. Straight to business. I met his gaze calmly. "I'm reviewing it," I replied. His smile tightened slightly. "Well," he said smoothly, "timing matters with these things." Then he walked away without waiting for my response. The conversation lingered in my mind long after he left. Timing matters. Not kindness. Not fairness. Timing? Moments later, Ethan passed by my table, his movement quick, distracted. As he walked past, he leaned slightly closer without stopping. "Just go along with it today," he whispered. Then he kept moving. No eye contact. No explanation. Just that sentence. The words echoed inside my mind again and again. Not support. Not reassurance. Compliance. Minutes later, a catering manager approached, holding a black folder against her chest. Her expression was professional, practiced, the kind of calm that came from handling logistics without emotion. "Miss Brooks?" she asked politely. I nodded once. She placed the folder gently on the table in front of me and opened it. Inside lay printed documents neatly clipped together. Vendor contracts, payment schedules, highlighted sections. My name appeared again, bold and unmistakable. Natalie Brooks. And below it, that signature. Perfectly copied. Perfectly wrong? As I stared at the page, I sensed movement beside me. My father stepped into view, standing close enough that his shadow fell across the table. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said quietly. No apology. No explanation. Just pressure. I looked up slowly and met his gaze directly for the first time that day. That was the moment I realized this wedding wasn't built to celebrate family. It was built to corner me. I walked into my hotel room long after the music faded, and the last round of applause echoed somewhere behind me. My heels dangled from my fingers as I closed the door quietly, the soft click sounding louder than it should have in the stillness. The room felt colder than before, heavier, like the air itself had thickened while I was gone. I set my shoes near the door and crossed slowly to the dresser, removing my earrings one at a time. The small metallic clink as they touched the surface sounded sharp against the silence. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My face looked calm. Too calm. Inside, everything felt tight, not panic. Not sadness, but awareness, a steady pressure sitting just beneath my ribs, reminding me that nothing about this day had been accidental. Nothing had been misunderstood. It had all been designed. My phone vibrated suddenly on the nightstand, breaking the silence. I turned toward it slowly. New email notification. Sender. Vendor Legal Department. Subject line. Guarantor confirmation pending. The words made my chest tighten slightly. I picked up the phone and opened the email carefully, reading each line with deliberate attention. The message was short, professional, emotionless. A reminder that the guarantor authorization remained incomplete. A notice that payment confirmation was expected. A warning that failure to respond would trigger escalation procedures. No warmth, no patience. Just expectation. I set the phone back down and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the darkened screen as the weight of the words settled into place. Escalation procedures. Legal language. Not family language. Morning arrived too quickly. Sunlight pushed through the thin hotel curtains, washing the room in pale brightness that felt almost harsh against tired eyes. I packed my bag slowly, folding each piece of clothing with careful precision, placing everything exactly where it belonged. No rushed movements. No panic. Just quiet control. I checked my phone once before leaving. No messages from my parents. No text from Ethan. No follow-up conversation from anyone. That silence spoke louder than any apology ever could. At the airport, travelers moved around me in clusters, couples sharing coffee, parents guiding sleepy children through security lines, friends laughing as they rolled suitcases behind them. Everyone looked connected, supported, belonging somewhere. I moved through the terminal alone, not lost, just separate. The flight home passed in a blur of muted sounds and distant conversations. I leaned back against the seat, staring out the window as clouds stretched endlessly beneath the plane. Somewhere between takeoff and landing, Ethan's whispered words replayed again in my mind. Just go along with it today. At the time, the words sounded like advice. Now they sounded like strategy. By the time I reached my apartment in Portland, exhaustion pressed heavily against my shoulders. The familiar scent of my home greeted me as I stepped inside, clean, quiet, predictable, safe. I set my suitcase near the door and moved through the familiar routine automatically. Shoes off. Keys on the counter. Lights on. Coffee brewing. For the next 2 days, life moved in careful silence. Work emails filled my mornings. Routine tasks filled my afternoons. No messages arrived from my family. No calls. No explanations. Nothing. The quiet stretched longer than expected, like the calm before something inevitable. On the afternoon of the second day, a sharp knock broke the silence. I froze mid-step, listening. Another knock followed, louder this time. When I opened the door, no one stood outside. Just a plain envelope resting on the floor. No return address. No handwritten name. Only my apartment number printed neatly across the front. A cold feeling settled into my stomach as I bent to pick it up. Inside was a stack of printed documents. Vendor contract copies. The same forms I had seen on the screen at the wedding. The same legal language. The same formatting. And at the bottom of the final page, my signature. Dark ink against white paper. Seeing it printed physically felt different from seeing it digitally. More permanent. More threatening. Real. I placed the papers carefully on the kitchen table, staring at them as the realization settled deeper into my chest. Someone wanted me to hold proof in my hands. Someone wanted this to move forward. 3 days passed like that, quiet, tense, waiting. Then, on the third afternoon, rain began tapping steadily against the windows, filling the apartment with a soft, rhythmic sound. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee growing cold between my hands. My phone lay beside it, silent, until it wasn't. The vibration startled me slightly, sharp against the wooden surface. Caller ID. Mom. I stared at the screen as it buzzed again, and again, and again. I let it ring longer than necessary before finally answering. Hello? For a moment, there was only breathing on the other end. Then her voice came through, tight, strained. Natalie, we have a problem. I didn't respond immediately. I let her continue. They're demanding payment, she said quickly. The vendor called again this morning. Her voice trembled slightly at the edges. They said the balance is $42,000. Hearing the number spoken aloud made something inside my chest shift. $42,000. Not theoretical. Not abstract. Real. They told us you were the guarantor, she added. Of course they did. Before I could respond, another voice joined the call. My father, your family, he said, his tone tight but controlled. We expected you to help. Not we made a mistake. Not we're sorry. Just expectation. If this goes to court, my mother added quickly, it affects all of us. The pressure in their voices filled the silence between words. Shared responsibility. Shared guilt. Shared fear. I listened quietly, letting them speak without interruption while my free hand reached toward my laptop. I opened the metadata file again. The same timestamp. The same Dallas IP address. The same undeniable connection to my father's office. Proof. Not suspicion. Proof. They said payment needs confirmation soon. My father continued. Otherwise, this becomes legal. It already was legal. They just hadn't accepted it yet. I inhaled slowly, steadying my voice before speaking. I didn't sign that document. Silence fell instantly on the other end of the line. Heavy. Unavoidable. It still has your name. My father replied quickly. There it was again. Deflection. Responsibility pushed outward instead of inward. I closed my laptop gently and stared at the dark screen. Moments later, I ended the call without promising anything. No agreement. No reassurance. Just silence. Seconds later, my phone vibrated again. Another email notification appeared. Sender. Law Office Services. Subject line. Notice of Financial Liability Review. I opened it slowly, reading each line carefully as the meaning settled deeper with every word. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just family pressure anymore. It had become a legal battle. I sat at my kitchen table long after the email finished loading, staring at the words until they blurred into one heavy thought. Notice of Financial Liability Review. The phrase repeated in my mind like a warning bell that refused to quiet. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the window, filling the silence with a soft, relentless rhythm. I read the email again, slower this time. The vendor had contacted a legal office. They were questioning the guarantee issued under my name. They expected a response. Not from my parents. From me. My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table as something inside me shifted from uncertainty into recognition. This is fraud. I whispered aloud. The word sounded unfamiliar in the quiet room. Heavy. Sharp. Final. Saying it changed something. It separated emotion from reality. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. It was about survival. I opened my laptop again and typed carefully into the search bar. Contract fraud lawyer Portland. Several results appeared instantly. But one stood out, a firm specializing in forged documents and liability disputes. The reviews were consistent. Calm. Precise. Professional. No drama. No chaos. Exactly what I needed. I clicked the contact link and scheduled the earliest available consultation. Same day. That decision alone felt like taking back control. By late afternoon, I stood in front of a tall office building downtown. The glass doors reflected the cloudy sky above, making the entrance feel colder than the world outside. Inside, everything was quiet, ordered, structured. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, not celebration, not family dinners, not forced smiles. Just business. A receptionist greeted me with a small, professional nod. "Ms. Brooks?" she asked. I nodded once. "Mr. Carter will see you now." She guided me down a narrow hallway lined with framed certificates and legal awards. Each one felt like a reminder of something my family had ignored. Consequences existed, whether they wanted them or not. When I stepped into the office, a man in his mid-40s stood from behind a clean desk. "Daniel Carter." He extended his hand. "Have a seat," he said calmly. I sat across from him and placed my folder on the desk between us. "Tell me what happened," he said. His tone carried no judgment, no impatience, just attention. So I explained everything. The rehearsal dinner, the clipboard, the forged signature, the printed documents, the phone calls from my parents, the legal email. He listened without interrupting, occasionally writing notes in neat, steady handwriting. His face remained neutral, focused. When I finished speaking, he leaned back slightly in his chair. "Did you ever physically sign this document?" he asked. "Not approve, not review. Sign." "No," I said firmly. He nodded once and pulled the printed contract closer, studying the signature carefully. Minutes passed in silence as he examined details I hadn't noticed before. His eyes moved slowly across the page, stopping occasionally as if measuring invisible lines. Then he opened the digital file on his computer. "Let's check the metadata," he said. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, pulling up file information. Creation timestamp. Upload location. Device source. He paused. "That's interesting," he murmured. My chest tightened slightly. "What is?" I asked. He turned the screen slightly toward me and pointed at a specific line. "This file was uploaded from Dallas," he said calmly. I leaned closer, my breath catching slightly. "That's where the wedding happened," I said. He nodded. "But more importantly," he added, "this upload came from a registered business network." The numbers on the screen looked painfully familiar. I didn't need confirmation. I recognized the address immediately. "My father's office," I whispered. Saying the words aloud made my throat tighten. Daniel nodded again. "And based on this timestamp," he continued, "you were logged into a different system at the same time. Meaning, impossible overlap, impossible responsibility." My chest loosened slightly as the weight of doubt finally began to lift. "This signature does not appear to originate from your device," he said. "Not emotional, not dramatic, just factual." But that statement landed heavier than anything else I had heard. Validation, relief, anger, all layered together. "But," he added, his tone sharpening slightly, "forgery alone doesn't automatically remove liability." The words snapped my focus back into place. "If the vendor believes this agreement is valid, they may attempt to collect payment from you," he explained. Silence filled the room as the reality settled deeper. Ignoring the situation wouldn't make it disappear. It would make it worse. I slid my laptop toward him. "I brought every email I received," I said. He opened the files methodically, reviewing messages one by one. His movements stayed calm, controlled, precise. Then he stopped, scrolled back, opened a specific attachment. There, he said quietly. I leaned forward. On the screen was an upload record attached to an earlier document, uploaded by Richard Brooks. My father, seeing his name attached directly to the file, made something inside my chest tighten painfully. Not suspicion anymore. Proof. Daniel leaned back slightly, studying the information. This appears intentional, he said. Not accidental. Not careless. Intentional. I swallowed slowly, the weight of that realization pressing against my ribs. Excusing myself briefly, I stepped outside the office building into the cool afternoon air. The city noise surrounded me, distant traffic, footsteps, voices, grounding me in the present moment. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. I was 7 years old, wobbling on a bicycle in our driveway. My father ran beside me, holding the back of the seat. You've got it, he told me. Don't stop now. That memory used to feel safe, comforting. Now it felt distant, unfamiliar. I took a slow breath, letting the past settle quietly behind me. When I returned inside, Daniel had already prepared a list of next steps. We'll notify the vendor that this authorization is disputed, he explained. We'll also request forensic analysis of the signature. I nodded slowly. If necessary, he added, legal action can be taken against whoever created this document. Legal action. Consequences. Real ones. By the time I left the office, the sky had darkened slightly, clouds gathering overhead like silent witnesses to everything that had unfolded. I reached my car and pulled my keys from my purse just as my phone vibrated again. Caller ED. Ethan. The first time my brother had called since the wedding. I stared at his name on the screen for several seconds before answering. That was the moment I realized they thought I was trapped. But now I finally knew where the trap began. My phone vibrated in my hand as I stood beside my car, the lawyer's office doors closing quietly behind me. Ethan's name flashed across the screen. For a moment, I just stared at it, letting the vibration continue. I wanted him to feel the delay, to understand that I wasn't waiting anymore. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Only then did I answer. Hello? There was breathing on the other end, uneven, rushed. Did you talk to a lawyer? Ethan asked. No greeting. No apology. Just urgency. Yes, I said calmly. Silence followed immediately. The kind of silence that felt like someone recalculating their next move. Things got out of hand, he said finally. His voice sounded strained, tight in a way I had never heard before. What things? I asked. More silence. Then a quiet exhale. The wedding, the costs, everything, he said. Madison's parents kept adding more stuff. Bigger venue, more guests, expensive vendors. I leaned lightly against the side of my car, listening carefully. They said it had to look perfect, he continued. Dad promised he'd handle it. Handle it. Not pay for it. Handle it. And how exactly was he planning to do that? I asked. Ethan hesitated. I could hear movement behind him, voices in the background. Muffled but tense. He said once everything was finished. You'd understand, Ethan admitted. The words landed heavier than expected. Not once everything was explained. Once everything was finished, meaning there had never been room for refusal. They expected me to sign at the reception, I said quietly. Another pause. Then, reluctantly, yes, that single word confirmed everything. The clipboard, the folder, the pressure. It had all been staged, carefully planned. You knew, I said. Not a question, a statement. I didn't know everything, Ethan replied quickly. But I knew Dad planned to ask you. Ask. The word felt weak, misleading. You spoke to them after the wedding, didn't you? I asked. Yes, he said. And now? I pressed. His breathing grew heavier. They're freaking out, he admitted. There it was. Fear. Finally. The vendor keeps calling, he continued. Madison's dad is furious. He says this could turn into a legal mess. Legal mess. I almost laughed at the understatement. I already told them I have legal representation, I said calmly. Silence hit the line again. Heavy. Sharp. What did the lawyer say? Ethan asked quietly. That the signature was forged, I replied, and the upload was traced back to Dad's office. For several seconds, there was nothing but silence. Not denial, not anger, just quiet shock. Mom is panicking, he said finally. The image formed easily in my mind, my mother pacing across the kitchen floor, wringing her hands, replaying conversations in her head. Dad didn't think it would go this far. Ethan added, Of course he didn't. People who build traps rarely imagine themselves caught inside them. They're saying payment is due immediately. Ethan continued, If it doesn't get paid, it goes into collections. Collections. The word settled heavily in my chest. That meant escalation. Pressure. Consequences. Put Dad on, I said. There was movement on the line. Muffled voices. A door closing somewhere in the background. Then a shift in breathing. My father's voice came through. Tighter than usual. You've made your point, he said. Not hello? Not how are you? Just frustration? I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch. This doesn't need to get worse, he continued. We just need to handle this quietly. Quietly. Like silence had protected anyone so far. You used my name, I said finally. My voice stayed steady. Controlled. Your family, he replied quickly. We thought you would help. Always that word. Family. Used like leverage. Used like obligation. I didn't sign that document, I said. Silence followed instantly. Thick. Heavy. It still has your name, he answered. The same argument. Repeated like it could change reality. And the upload carries yours, I replied. The words landed cleanly. Precise? Final. For the first time in my life, I heard uncertainty in my father's breathing. Not authority. Not confidence. Uncertainty. What do you want? He asked. The question sounded smaller than anything he had said before. Behind him, I heard my mother's voice, faint at first, then clearer. Crying. Soft. Uncontrolled. That sound pressed against my chest, pulling at memories I wasn't ready to revisit. But I didn't let it change my voice. Not now. Not anymore. I want the truth documented, I said calmly. Not revenge. Not punishment. Truth. Silence filled the line again. Then the call ended. No shouting. No resolution. Just distance. I lowered the phone slowly and leaned back against my car, staring at the cloudy sky above. For the first time since this began, my hands didn't tremble. My breathing stayed steady. Controlled. Prepared. Seconds later, my phone vibrated again. Another message. From the vendor. Subject line. Collection notice issued. Secondary parties contacted. I opened it carefully, reading each line with slow, deliberate focus. The notice confirmed what Ethan had hinted at. Collection procedures had begun. Directed toward my parents. Not me. Not anymore. I locked my phone and slipped it into my purse, letting the meaning settle deep inside my chest. That was the moment I realized the pressure they built for me had finally turned back on them. The morning felt quieter than it had in days. The kind of quiet that follows after a storm has already done its damage. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin golden lines, stretching across my kitchen table where my laptop still sat open from the night before. I wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee. Though I hadn't taken a single sip yet, my phone buzzed softly beside it. A new message from Ethan. They're asking Dad to meet with the vendor today. I read the sentence twice, letting it settle slowly into place. Not a request. Not a discussion. A meeting. Consequences were moving now. Not emotionally. Legally. I leaned back in my chair, staring toward the window as the realization settled deeper into my chest. For the first time since the wedding, the pressure I had been carrying didn't feel centered on me anymore. It had shifted. Later that afternoon, another message arrived. They're demanding a payment schedule. Then another. Madison's dad is furious. Each short update carried the same tone. Anxious. Uncertain. Stripped of the confidence my family once carried so easily. The words felt rushed, like they were being typed in between arguments and urgent phone calls. Then came the message that made everything clearer. There are more unpaid balances than just yours. More. Not one bill. Not one mistake. A pattern. I closed my eyes briefly as the truth settled into place. I had never been their solution. I had been their safety net. The one person they believed would step in quietly, absorb the cost, and keep everything from collapsing. That belief had almost worked. But not this time. Late that evening, my phone rang again. Caller ID. Mom? I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering, letting the silence steady my breathing. Hello. Her voice sounded different this time. Not sharp. Not commanding. Tired. Exhausted. Natalie, she said softly. The pause that followed felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. They met with the vendor today, she continued. I didn't interrupt. I let her speak. They're insisting on immediate payment arrangements, she said. Your father tried to negotiate, but they have documentation. Documentation. That word hung in the air between us. Finally. Her voice cracked slightly. We didn't mean for it to go this far. I leaned back slowly in my chair, pressing my palm against the edge of the table. What did you mean for it to do? I asked quietly. Silence followed. Long, heavy. Then, slowly, she spoke again. The business hasn't been doing well, she admitted. That sentence landed harder than anything else she could have said. Debt. Struggles. Hidden problems. All quietly buried beneath appearances. We were behind on several payments, she continued. Your father thought if the wedding went well, it would help stabilize things, create opportunities. Opportunities. The word sounded hollow. And he believed you could protect us, she added softly. Protect. Not help. Not support. Protect. So he used my name, I said. Not accusing. Just stating the truth. Another long silence followed. Yes, she whispered. That single word carried more weight than any apology ever could. I let the quiet stretch between us, listening to the faint sound of her breathing through the phone. Somewhere in the background, I could hear distant movement, cabinets opening, footsteps pacing, chaos, uncertainty, consequences. I won't pay for something I didn't agree to, I said calmly. My voice didn't rise, didn't shake. It stayed steady, clear. There was no anger left in my words, just boundaries. I understand, she said quietly. And for the first time in days, that response sounded real, not defensive, not manipulative, just tired. We ended the call without another argument. No shouting, no final demands, just silence. I set the phone down and sat still for several minutes, letting the quiet settle around me like a blanket. Outside, rain began falling again, tapping softly against the windows in a familiar rhythm. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Sunday dinners from years ago. The smell of roasted chicken filling the house. My father laughing at something Ethan said. My mother setting plates on the table. For a moment, that memory felt warm, comforting. Then it shifted. Because memories could be real, and still not excuse betrayal. Another notification buzzed on my phone. A message from my friend Claire. You sounded off the other day. Dinner tonight. My place. Simple. Direct. No expectations. Just care. I smiled faintly as I typed back. Yeah, I'd like that. That small exchange felt different from everything else that had happened over the past week. No pressure. No manipulation. Just presence. Later that evening, I opened my laptop one final time and stared at the forged document still saved on my desktop. For days, that file had felt like a threat, a weapon. Now it looked different. Just evidence. Proof of something I survived. I hovered my cursor over the file, paused, then clicked delete. The icon disappeared from the screen instantly, not erasing the past, just releasing its hold over my present. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly, feeling something inside me settle for the first time in days. Not relief, not victory. Peace. A quiet understanding formed as I stared out the window into the rainy evening. Family isn't defined by obligation. It isn't measured by how much weight you can carry for others. And love, real love, never requires you to risk your future just to keep someone else comfortable. Sometimes, the hardest lesson isn't learning how to forgive. It's learning how to protect yourself, how to say no, how to stand still when pressure demands movement. And if you've ever found yourself in a moment where family expected you to carry something that wasn't yours, then you know how heavy that silence can feel. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever had to draw a boundary that no one else wanted you to draw, share your thoughts below. Your voice matters more than you think, and someone reading your story might find the courage they didn't know they needed. And if stories about strength, boundaries, and standing up for yourself speak to your heart, stay with us, because there are more stories ahead that remind us all how powerful quiet strength can be. That was the moment I finally understood. Sometimes the strongest form of revenge isn't hurting them back. It's refusing to carry what was never yours to begin with.